So I set out to make a guitar out of piano keys. That was the original vision. And first things first, I had to find a piano. And this one fit the bill well to be destroyed because the lady I bought it from said that she had somebody come out and tune it and it couldn't really hold a tuning anymore, and it was not really worth putting money into and fixing up, and so she didn't want it anymore, and I didn't want to destroy a piano that someone could still get a lot of use out of and enjoyment from. And then I had to destroy it, take it apart. I wound up just doing it all in her house, just right there. Here's a clip of prying some parts off. And the whole process of taking it apart took about 2 days. I had to go back the next day to finish taking it apart and getting all the parts out of her house. It was a big job. And here was all the piano keys just taken off and laid out in my living room. And then I had to chop off the back end of the keys that sits inside of the piano, and so I did that with a big saw. And then this was all the keys laid out on the floor after just being cut up. And this is the keys all laid out with the guitar parts set on top of it. The idea was just to make it a really simple guitar with one pickup, a wraparound bridge, and one volume knob. And so this was pretty much all the hardware that I needed for the body. And I decided I needed to lower the black keys because they sit up pretty tall above the white keys, and I didn't think that that was going to work. You know, how high the strings sit off of the body of the guitar, which was going to be the white keys. I didn't think that they were going to be able to clear the black keys very well. So I sanded the bottoms of the black keys down to be about the height of this one in front here. And this is the keys sitting on top of the piece of wood that I decided I was going to put underneath them, because in order to attach all of the white keys to get them to stay together, I needed to put them onto another piece of wood. And the wood I chose was the part that's in the front of the piano, underneath the keys, above the pedals. There's probably a name for it, but I'm not sure what it is. There's this big long piece that wasn't a solid piece of wood. There's a mahogany veneer around the entire piano, so it wasn't going to be a real pretty piece of wood, but the front of it was a nice piece of mahogany, and so the plan was to sand that down, and then the back of the guitar would be that front of this piece of wood. And I took some wood glue and just went one by one, glued all the keys down, the white keys and the black keys. And then this is a picture of all the white keys and the black keys glued to that front piece of the piano that's now the back of the guitar. And this is them leaning up against an amp. And then I made a template out of that same big long piece of wood. This was going to be the shape. I just traced around my Gibson Les Paul Jr., and that was the design I was copying. I wasn't going for any sort of originality here, other than the fact that it was made out of piano keys. And this is the template on top of the keys that I was going to basically just trace around and cut off any excess keys that I didn't need. And then I clamped it down so it wouldn't go anywhere, and then I traced around it, just kind of a rough tracing around the actual keys so that I could take the template off and then start cutting it out and get a rough shape. And here's the first little chunk that I took off of the corner there. And then there's a little bit more taken off, and even more taken off, making it a little more rounded. And then a little more taken off with the cutaway starting to take shape up in the upper left. And then what I realized after I was doing all of that cutting, I was using a scroll saw. The blade was getting caught in mostly the black keys, but a little bit of the white keys too. And it was just throwing the black keys off because they were only held down by wood glue. So what I did was I took a syringe and I filled it up with epoxy resin, and I just injected it down in there in between the black keys and the white keys. And here's another picture of it, a little more taped off, and I put some in on the right side and the left side of each black key because every white key is touching a black key on one side or another. And so the resin, theoretically, was going to make contact with both the black keys and all the white keys, and hopefully hold everything in place a little bit better than the wood glue did. And so here it was after the gluing. So then I was ready to take it to the next level of cutting and sawing. And that was this. I clamped the template back onto the top, and I took a router with a trim bit that could go right up against the template and cut into the keys, but it could only go so low, so I could really only get the very top of the keys cut off. And so that's kind of what it looked like, where it was just the top 1/4 inch or so of the white keys cut off. And so that's what it looked like at the end of it. So I had the final shape of the guitar cut out of the top of the keys, and so here's what that looked like. And so then what I did was I took the scroll saw and just inched closer and closer to the actual shape of the guitar, trying not to go in too far, obviously. And so I wound up with a pretty close final cut with that. Here's a close-up of about how close I got. So I left a little bit just because I didn't want to have any accidents. And so then over the course of probably a couple months, I just hand sanded down every little excess bit of key that was sticking out a little bit so that it met that shape that was cut out along the top edge of the keys. And so then once I got this far and the body had taken its shape, I took the step of ordering the hardware, and this was all from StewMac, and I got pre-cut fret wire and some fret cutters and a pre-slotted fretboard, and I got a truss rod and an output jack and an unbleached bone nut and the jack plate and 3 on a plate tuners. And then I went back to the router and cut out the truss rod channel. And that's what it looked like after it was cut. And then I drew on the left-hand side, you can see the headstock angle, and I cut off the top of the headstock to get that angle, and I just kind of put on the truss rod cover and the nut there and the fretboard just to see what it was going to look like. And then I drilled out and kind of sanded out by hand to make it a little smoother the access cavity for the truss rod. Then I clamped down the fretboard and glued it down with tight bond. And then I drew in the headstock shape that I was going for, which again was just the copy of the Gibson headstock. I wasn't trying to be original at all. And then I went to the bandsaw and I cut off the extra wood around the edges of the neck. And this is what I was left with. I still was being really, really conservative with my cutting because I didn't want to make a mistake, so I left a lot of the fretboard there so that I could slowly inch into the final shape later. And you can see I removed some off of the headstock, so that was starting to take shape. And then here I got it pretty close to the final shape. I did most of that with a belt sander and then a lot of hand sanding just to get the curves in there. And so this was pretty much the final shape of the neck after a whole lot of filing wood away with some rasps and a whole lot of sandpaper. And there's another couple of angles here of it where you can see the fretboard, and with the belt sander I removed the rest of the wood to get the final shape of the fretboard. And on the back of the neck by the headstock I decided to put a volute, which is the little bump, so that it gives a little extra material and a little extra strength to the neck so that the headstock doesn't snap off if it takes a fall. And then it was time to drill out the holes for the tuners. So I made 3 little pilot holes on each side and then drilled with the proper bit. And then 3 more. And now it's time to start working on the actual fretboard and drilling out the dot inlays, the fret position markers. And so I got my drill press and drilled out all the holes on the 3rd and 5th, 7th, 9th, 12th, and the rest frets. And I had to figure out what kind of material I was going to put in there. I wanted as much as possible of this guitar to be from the piano. And after a lot of research and trying to find the right tools to do this, I figured out that if I get a plug cutter and put it in the drill press, I can cut a bunch of holes out of a piano key top, and then you just place them right in the holes in the fretboard, and I glued them in with super glue, and then you have piano key top fret inlays. And then I sanded them down to get them flush with the fretboard. And this is them done with a close-up there. And then it was time to put in the frets, so I used, I think it was the rubber end I was using of that hammer on the left side there to hammer them down. And then I used my new fret cutter to cut off the extra. And then it was a whole lot of filing to get the edges of the frets not sharp anymore, and sanding to make them flush with the edge of the fretboard. And I still had one more type of inlay that I needed to figure out what I was going to do for, which was the side dots. And I found these little sort of copper-colored pieces of metal in my box of just random parts that came from the piano. and I couldn't even really remember where they came from, but I actually took a video of them being removed, and there are these little pieces, I'm not sure what they're called, but they basically held the strings in place into the bridge, I guess you call it, of the piano. I'm not sure if that's what that part's called or not, but this is a video of them being removed. And so I drilled out holes that were the same size as those little pieces. I pounded them in, and here's them sticking out, being very dangerous looking. And then snipped them off with my little fret cutters and sanded them flush. And then here are my finished side dots. And so it was time to start finishing, and so I sanded down. This is what the back of the guitar that the keys were on looked like with that mahogany veneer. This was actually the back of the template here, and then this was the back of the actual guitar. And I sanded. I went very slowly because the veneer is really thin, so I didn't want to sand through it. And so this was most of that red color removed. And then this is when I decided that I wasn't going to go anymore because I didn't want to go too far. So that was the color of the bare mahogany with not much stain left in it. And here's a couple of close-up pictures just because I thought they looked pretty. And once that was done, I started staining. I took some ebony stain and I went around the edges first. And here's one coat of stain on the back. And a second coat. I did 2 or 3 coats at least on the back and the sides. And then it was time for the headstock and the back of the neck. And here's the back after I wiped a lot of the excess stain off. And this was the back of the neck after I wiped all the excess stain off. And then I decided for the finishing coat, I put True Oil on, which is a finish that is basically clear. It sort of adds an amber color to it a little bit, but it's basically an oil that you rub on with the cloth. And here's a picture of the back with the True Oil, and the back of the headstock on the right side, and then the neck on the left side is no True Oil yet. And this is the back of the body with no True Oil, and then with a coat of True Oil, so it just makes it a little darker and richer looking. And I wound up putting 5 or so coats on, I think. And then the really scary stuff started, because this was the routing of the neck pocket. And this is where I didn't know if these keys were going to start flying off, because I hadn't used the router on any of this yet. And I made a template, which is what I clamped to the top, and just a few angles of it. And then by the end, I lost 2 little bits of the black keys. You can see the gaps at the top there, but everything else went pretty well, I thought. I took a little piece of a white key and put it in that gap there, and then as a side benefit, that was going to cover up the not great routing job that I did once I glued the neck in. This was going to hide it a little bit better, so it would look a little cleaner. And then I clamped it down and put a whole bunch of wood glue in there, and it wound up being pretty much the angle that I was going for. And here it was time to drill out the holes for the bridge posts, and so I used the drill press, drilled down for the treble side, and then here on the bass side, and there's both of them. And then I made a template for the pickup to route out the pickup cavity. And here's that happening. And then here's the fairly ugly cavity for the pickup drilled out. And then it was time to route out the cavity for the electronics, and there was just going to be one potentiometer in there, just one volume knob, so it didn't need to be very big. So I just made a little square template, clamped it down, and then routed it out. And I left a couple little ledges there in the center, on the top and the bottom, so that I could screw in the holes for the cover. And what I decided to make the cover out of was piano keys. And I took 2 bits of the thicker end of the white keys and 2 little bits of the thinner end of the white keys, sort of on the back half of the key. And with those 2 thinner strips, I superglued those to the back of the bigger pieces. And then this is what that looked like. And I rounded off the edges a little bit to make it a little neater looking, and drilled out a couple of holes and put the screws in. A little uneven, but that's okay. And I drilled the hole for the potentiometer to stick through so that the volume knob could attach. And then another especially scary part, which is drilling the hole for the output jack. And also through that hole you drill all the way up to the pickup cavity so that the pickup wire can come to the control cavity and then all the way to the output jack. And so I needed a super long drill bit. I think this one was a 12-inch drill bit that you just point and pray and hope that it goes where it needs to go. And then here was a little hole sort of in the center, a little bit to the right. You can see it there where I needed to drill down just a little bit to meet the hole that I actually drilled with that 12-inch drill bit, because it was a little bit below the actual opening in the cavity. And after that I had to drill another hole inside of the bridge post hole so that the ground wire could go from the electronics into the bridge post so that it touched that metal and then grounded it. And here's a picture with the little wire sticking out in the inside. And then I put in the bridge posts and put the bridge on it. And here's the pickup in. And I fed all the wires through those little channels inside where they needed to go. And I wired up the volume pot. Screwed in the output jack and the jack plate. This was a knob from a Gretsch guitar that I had taken the knob off of. And then this was it initially strung up just to see if everything worked. I finally permanently installed the tuners, and then here was that unbleached bone nut blank that I had to cut out entirely myself. So I started the slots here for each of the 6 strings, and you can see those middle 2 strings, the G and the D, I have angled out a little bit so that they run straighter to the tuners at the top of the headstock. And then I marked out all of the material I still needed to remove, and I did that with a belt sander. And then I did some final shaping. But here's the nut installed with the strings on, and I put on the truss rod cover. And then here's your finished Keytar. And if you hadn't noticed up to this point, I'm left-handed, so that's why it's pointing the opposite way. And here's the back with that stained mahogany. I think looks pretty cool. And here it is hanging up with some of my other guitars. And this is a side-by-side from the original kind of rough drawing that I did of what I wanted to look like versus the finished product. It lost an extra knob down there. I was going to do a volume and tone originally, but other than that, it turned out pretty much how I was envisioning, so can't say that I'm displeased with how the final product looks.